Over the past few months, rumours have persisted that Final Fantasy XVI would be revealed as a PlayStation 5 exclusive. This started ahead of the initial showcase back in June, where there was a big leak that contained some details about Final Fantasy XVI, as well as details of a game called Crimson Arbitrium, Agni's Anthology. After the showcase had aired, there had indeed been a brand new Square Enix game revealed, and it was from the team at Luminous Productions, but instead of being called Crimson Arbitrium, it was presented to the world as Project Athia, a working title. Despite the reveal of this particular game, there was no word on Final Fantasy XVI at this point, but between now and then, there has been a steady stream of things happening that suggested a reveal was imminent. Square Enix, for example, alerted sleuths by preemptively registering English and Japanese Twitter accounts, and this turned out to be a good signal, as they did indeed use the pre-registered Japanese account, but not the English one. Journalists like Imran Khan from Kinda Funny Games also alerted fans by talking about how Sony were aggressively pursuing exclusive arrangements with third-party publishers through what was being dubbed as PlayStation Advantage, and it was mentioned on forums like Reset Era that Final Fantasy XVI would be part of this initiative. And now that the most recent PlayStation 5 showcase has wrapped up, it feels surreal to say that Final Fantasy XVI is real, and it will be a timed PlayStation 5 exclusive, with a PC version also in the works, although that has since been retracted. I say it feels surreal because for some, this has been a long journey. Never in the history of the franchise have we gone this long after the release of the previous numbered game without knowing about the next numbered game. And there's also that, even though some of these rumours have been persisting for the past few months, for others, rumours about Final Fantasy XVI have been persisting for about 6 years. There have been many sources for these rumours, but one was an individual called One Truth who did some detective work, as like many of us, he was curious about what had happened to Hiroyuki Ito. Despite being one of the most important figures working on the Final Fantasy franchise for many years, he has not worked on any major external project since the completion of Final Fantasy XII, and even though it's not been declared, he may still be working on Final Fantasy XVI, but if so, it would be in a more behind-the-scenes role. Rumours had also cropped up that Naoki Yoshida, the director and producer of Final Fantasy XIV, was working on Final Fantasy XVI. This was spurred by imagery that had appeared on the Business Division 3 recruitment page, and when we asked him 2 years ago about whether he'd like to work on an offline Final Fantasy game, Yoshida said that although he had no specific desire to do so, to the point where he'd quit if he wasn't able to make it, he did have some ideas that related to creating a world of high fantasy. However, he would only work towards creating that game if the company asked him to do so. He had since dismissed notions that he would leave Final Fantasy XIV to work on such a project, but at that time he did not flat out deny that he was working on Final Fantasy XVI, and now we know why, as it was revealed that Final Fantasy XVI is indeed being developed within Creative Business Division 3, the same division that works on Final Fantasy XIV, and that Naoki Yoshida will be serving as the game's producer alongside his work as the producer and director of Final Fantasy XIV. The director role will instead be filled by Hiroshi Takai, a veteran of the company, and this is a very interesting move. Takai joined Square approximately in 1991, but his first major role with the franchise came with Final Fantasy V, where he worked on battle graphics. After working on games within the Saga and Mana franchises, Takai then joined the Final Fantasy XI team as a visual effects designer before leaving to serve as the battle director on the Romancing Saga remake. He then directed The Last Remnant, before joining the Final Fantasy XIV team as a senior member during its rebuilding process, and this is where he met Naoki Yoshida. Takai was appointed as an assistant director on Final Fantasy XIV, and his first release was patch 1.19. He was then a core part of its relaunch as A Realm Reborn, and he also served as an assistant director on Heavensward. After this, Takai shifted to becoming a development supervisor, but after fulfilling this role on Stormblood, it appears as though Takai left the Final Fantasy XIV team to start work on Final Fantasy XVI, as he did not work on any other major patches or Shadowbringers, and was only given a special thanks. Based on this, we can conclude that work has already been underway on Final Fantasy XVI for a good while, with full development commencing approximately a year ago, and that's a pretty exciting prospect, as it means the game could be quite far along. In terms of other staff, it's safe to assume that Ryota Suzuki will be serving as the battle director. He joined Creative Business Division 3 last year from Capcom, having worked on Dragon's Dogma and Devil May Cry 5. In an interview published a few months ago, he noted that he feels the notion of a command-based RPG is an old-fashioned concept, and that his objective is to make a compelling action RPG. It's also being speculated that Soken, who has done fantastic work with Final Fantasy XIV, is composing the main soundtrack. And to add to this speculation, he did retweet the announcement of Final Fantasy XVI. This doesn't seem like such a big deal, and it could just be that he's supporting his colleagues, but it is worth noting that Soken did not speak about or retweet anything related to the Final Fantasy VII Remake in or around its launch. Another staff member who could be of interest is Kazutoyo Maehiro. He served as the technical director on Final Fantasy XIV up until the release of Stormblood, but prior to that, he also worked on The Last Remnant with Sakai and was a prominent part of Matsuno's team, having worked on Tactics, Vagrant Story, and Final Fantasy XII. But while this is all great information, let's get on to the Final Fantasy XVI trailer analysis, as there was so much content housed within, and it's still kind of crazy that they've shown off so much straight off the bat. And in that regard, we're going to be going as granular as we can, knowing what we do. Perhaps the best place to start in that regard is the association with Final Fantasy XIV. As an independent property, 14 has continued to grow from strength to strength since its relaunch as A Realm Reborn, and after the release of Shadowbringers, which received a 91 on Metacritic and was praised for its rich story, intense music, and compelling gameplay mechanics, many have been wanting a similar experience without having to pay the subscription fee. This could be that experience. In that regard, it feels like a very smart decision, as even though there have been comments that what we've seen doesn't look or feel very Final Fantasy, the reality is that Final Fantasy XIV has done well enough to stake a claim as being used as a benchmark in that comparison. And by building upon their work of 14, it may help to provide something that's been missing within the Final Fantasy brand for some time now: consistency. In the older days of the franchise, even though a lot of elements were refreshed between releases, the core Final Fantasy foundations were always present. Yoshinori Kitase chose to mix things up with the release of Final Fantasy VII, but he then stuck to that style with the subsequent releases of Final Fantasy VIII and X, whereas Sakaguchi and Ito used Final Fantasy IX to pay tribute to the older games. But following the release of Final Fantasy X, each main numbered game has had only loose connections with what came before, and it's led to the fanbase becoming quite splintered. Even though Final Fantasy XVI may still add to that, if there are similarities with 14, then it could also help to address that. Not only should the game be of interest to main series veterans, but it should also be appealing to those who have used the MMO as an entry point and have not yet ventured out. As with every new game, it will also appeal to those who have yet to experience a Final Fantasy game, and it may also encourage this group to then check out Final Fantasy XIV afterwards if they have a good time. Right now though, if we're looking at the content of the trailer, the association between the two games is most apparent with the game's visuals. They are very similar to the style seen within Final Fantasy XIV, and although right now they do lack a certain polish, that's often a trade-off developers make when announcing a game that isn't releasing imminently without using a pre-rendered trailer. We only have to look at Kingdom Hearts 3 and the Final Fantasy VII Remake as examples of how things can change in this regard, so right now, it's not all that concerning. And honestly, despite some of the character models and animations feeling like they do need a bit of love, even though this was all captured using the in-game engine, some of the sequences still looked jaw-dropping, and it's going to be interesting to see how this aspect builds out. Perhaps the most interesting illusions though came with what we saw of the game's lore. In the initial sense, it's telling that within the universe, summons are referred to as icons. This was a term used within Final Fantasy XIV by the Alags to refer to the most ancient primals. In Greek, the word closest to icon also means image, illustration or figure, and it appears as though armies associated with icons have an image or tattoo painted on themselves to designate this association. The main character, for example, features a tattoo on his face, as do his cohorts, but we also see another tattoo on an opposing warrior who's fighting on the battlefield. Something similar was used within Final Fantasy XIV, as for example, members of the Circle of Knowing bear a tattoo to show their affiliation, albeit not to a primal or icon. This concept was also used within Final Fantasy XIII to denote that an individual had been branded as a lessee by an associated fal'Cie. Throughout the trailer, we got to see 4, potentially 5 icons, and they seem to be pivotal to the story, much as they have been within Final Fantasy XIV and many other games within the franchise. To build upon this notion, the story seems to be rooted in a battle that's being waged between kingdoms, each of which is attempting to protect what they call their mother crystals, another term borrowed from Final Fantasy XIV. This is a common theme throughout many Final Fantasy games, as crystals are often the bedrock of society, and if they are harmed, then the land suffers. In Final Fantasy XV, for example, it was central to the plot, as the Kingdom of Lucis drew its power from the crystal, but there also appears to be an interesting parallel with Final Fantasy Type 0. Within this particular game, each nation's armies drew power from the crystal in different ways, and champions, known as the Primus and Secundus Lacy, had a much closer connection with the crystal, able to wield even greater powers. It also feels like there are parallels with Final Fantasy Tactics and Ivalice in general, which has often focused on conflict between nations, and with the game presenting itself as a more mature option, perhaps it will be a return to form in that regard. Going back to the Type 0 connection, within 16, each icon has someone called a dominant, an individual with whom it has a close connection. This could be another name for a summoner, or it could be an iteration of what we saw throughout the Fabula Nova Crystallis franchise. Now, the story of 16 appears to revolve around this man, who is on a quest for vengeance. In an earlier timeline, we saw that he was the Knight Protector and sworn shield of Phoenix's dominant, a boy named Joshua, who is the Archduke's son. But we also got to see him much older, this time with a brand, although we don't know to which icon he is aligned. All we know is that he is part of an elite group who seem similar to the Kingsglaive that are tasked with bringing down Shiva's dominant, a woman, and such is the power that dominants wield that defeating them alone can turn the tide in a battle. Like Final Fantasy XV, icons appear to be huge beings, and Titan has a very similar vibe. But another parallel is that in one of the realms there appears to be a blight that's spreading across the land, but they are struggling to hold it back without the blessing of their mother crystal. This could be similar to Miasma in Crystal Chronicles, where crystals keep it at bay and provide sanctuary, or it could be like what we saw in Final Fantasy XV with the Star Scourge. On one hand, it looks as though Joshua may be attempting to heal people from the affliction by using his connection with Phoenix, which has been used to revive people. In the trailer we got to see this applied to the main character, and it feels similar to how Arden Azunia and Lunafreya Nox Flare healed people from the Star Scourge. It could also be, though, that Joshua is imbuing the main character with the power of the Phoenix, which would again be similar to 15, as the King of Lucis is able to provide this function to his soldiers. And this would make sense, as throughout numerous combat segments, we got to see the Wing of Phoenix feature as a gameplay mechanic. The main character also wielded Titan's fists and what appears to be Garuda's claw, suggesting that the power of multiple icons can be leveraged in this way to enhance the protagonist's combat abilities. This could then be an interesting incorporation of what we saw within Devil May Cry 5, where Dante could shift between combat styles on the fly. It also looks like juggling mechanics will play a part in combat, much like in Devil May Cry, and that the player will need to be quite reactive in terms of mobility and also defensive play. Now, Phoenix is often associated with fire, and this is denoted by the back of Joshua's hand and the flames wielded by the protagonist, but also the phrasing later on in the trailer, as in addition to Phoenix, they refer to a second icon associated with the fire element, Ifrit. During this particular scene, we see Joshua summon Phoenix as a last resort, but one of the more senior military figures from his kingdom is then shocked to see that Ifrit has also appeared, as apparently it should be impossible for two icons to have the same element. Now, there's a few interpretations of what's going on here. One potential is that due to the harrowing events Joshua has just witnessed, something latent awakens within him and brings forth the Ifrit icon. But there's also the potential that there is another dominant who appears and they are aligned with Ifrit. It's clear though that they're attempting to position Ifrit as the antagonist, much like he was within Final Fantasy XV, and this is based not only of his actions, but also his colouring. Purple is often used to denote evil within the realm of Final Fantasy, and it cannot be accidental that Ifrit is coloured purple within the game's logo, and that right at the end of the trailer, the colour purple collides with that of the orange-yellow colour in front of the protagonist's eyes. Outside of this, it was pleasing to see chocobos being used in combat right off the bat, as well as the appearance of Imperials. Much like they always are, it appears as though they will be one of the aggressors within the narrative, and in the brief interaction we saw, we know that Dragoons will be associated with the Empire, much like they were within Final Fantasy XV thanks to Aranea. It also appears as though this particular Dragoon is wielding the power of lightning, suggesting that Ramuh may make an appearance. Then again, it could also be another summon like Odin, who was associated with lightning in Final Fantasy XIII, or Ixion, who was the lightning summon in Final Fantasy X. We also got to see a very angry looking Marlborough and a Carl, as well as a Goblin. These are each classic Final Fantasy enemies, but based on these encounters, there are question marks as to whether this will be a solo adventure as opposed to the party-based adventures we've grown accustomed to. Within the Goblin encounter, there was an ally on the battlefield, but without any kind of UI, it's difficult to tell if this was just a guest character or someone more permanent. Outside of this, it was also nice to hear both the Final Fantasy theme and a rendition of the Prelude. The former was absent in both Final Fantasy XIII and Final Fantasy XV, at least in regards to the main game, so it was nice to hear a return, whereas the Prelude has always appeared in some shape or form, and it sounded great. In terms of the wider lore, Dalmex were introduced in speech for the first time, and this could either be one of the nations or a group of individuals. And in addition to the Imperials, we also learned that another faction is the Crusaders, who were of course a group of warriors within Final Fantasy X. I think though, that's about everything we can pull out for now. In a press release, Naoki Yoshida said that they are planning to have their next big reveal of information at some point during 2021, and he hopes that fans will have fun speculating about the game until then. Who knows when it may release though. If it's true that they have been working on this since 2017 and ramped up development at some point during last year, it may not be that far away, but this is Square Enix, so there's always a chance we won't be seeing this game for another 4 to 5 years. Now that you've had some time to digest everything you've seen though, how are you feeling about the game? We put up a poll earlier today, and on the whole, people seem pretty positive, although it's nowhere near a unanimous opinion. And I'd say that comes down to their decision to have the announcement trailer use the in-game engine as opposed to a target render, which is what would be more common. Nonetheless, with both Final Fantasy XVI and Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 2 on the horizon, and with Final Fantasy XIV continuing to grow from strength to strength, it's a hell of a time to be a Final Fantasy fan. We look forward to hearing your thoughts in the comments, and if you found anything else that we've missed, then please do let us know. If you enjoyed this breakdown though, then toss us a like and feel free to subscribe to our channel. Alright guys, this is Daryl signing out. A big thanks to all of our Patreon and YouTube membership supporters, and of course, a big thanks to all of you for watching this video. I hope to see you all again soon for more Final Fantasy goodness.